The overdose epidemic is a critical issue surrounding Canadian communities across each province. With the rate of overdose-related deaths increasing every year, each perspective has been met with much more resistance and much more division. While one side aims to strengthen the criminalization of drug use, the other works tirelessly to treat those who are at an all-time low. The epidemic is a complex and lengthy issue that will be explored through two different films. So, is the overdose epidemic simply a topic to turn away from, or is it something much, much more? Flood is a 2020 Canadian-based short film that aims to open the door towards the realities of overdose-related deaths. The film connects with various people in different provinces in Canada to speak about their own experiences with opioids and addiction. Through these encounters, Flood aims to reduce the stigma surrounding addictions and overdose through harm reduction strategies and social factors around substance abuse. For effective change to happen, people must look at the main issues surrounding overdose. Fred Dunham, a harm reduction worker for the Sudbury Action Centre for Youth, describes one of the critical issues surrounding the current overdose epidemic.
Some of these people, they're like, I don't want to hear the scary stuff. I don't want to hear about the drugs anymore. And I said, you know what? You don't understand what fear is until you're a 15-year-old girl and you're sleeping on cardboard tonight in the bush. That's scary.
The stigma surrounding substance use drives people away from support and makes good-meaning people turn their backs towards the problem. The story of Leah Bell, a peer support worker, is one of many whose lives turned towards substance abuse due to social factors. Her mother was an alcoholic despite being a psychiatric nurse. As a result, her father turned to adultery and eventually led to him leaving the family. Leah's mother eventually completed suicide shortly after. She describes how these negative social factors turned her towards drugs.
So as soon as I discovered drugs, I absolutely fell in love with them. It filled a void in me that I didn't ever think could be filled.
Another one of these stories is from Irene Patterson, a member of Moms Stop the Harm, a network designed to bring aid and comfort of those who have lost loved ones due to overdose. She describes the epidemic in a few words.
Addiction is a disease. It's not something you can just say no to because your mum tells you to.
According to her, you can't just say no to addiction. It's a disease that spreads across your body and affects your mind and behaviors. This disease can be further spread by simply ignoring the problem. People who look at those affected by addiction and gaze away are yet another issue surrounding overdose. The narrator explains how stigmatization can affect those who suffer from addiction from receiving the help they need.
Everyone alive today grew up surrounded by deep stigmatization towards people who use drugs. From health inequality to discriminatory policies, socially excluding those whose reality we don't understand is common practice in our society. But the consequences for people who use drugs have proven to be catastrophic, and addressing the situation is dire.
Again, one of the main issues is that society tends to stigmatize those with drug addictions. Some people have a preconceived idea that individuals struggling with addiction can quit at any time. However, unless it affects them personally or someone they know, people will almost never try to help those in the overdose epidemic. Jenny Kwan, a member of parliament from East Vancouver, noticed an increased hostility towards addicts.
I had people actually say things to me at that time as a minister, say things to me like, what do we care? Why don't we just put them all in a cage and dump them to the bottom of the ocean? I mean, people actually said things like that to me, and I just thought like, oh my God, you're kidding, right? But some people do feel that way, you know.
The last main issue regarding the overdose epidemic is the continued criminalization of those who possess and use drugs. The criminalization of drug possession is a term used to describe the increasing mandatory minimum sentences for various charges relating to drug use. This idea heightened in 1973 when Richard Nixon waged the war on drugs just south of the border. Despite these policies occurring in the United States, their influence has spread across Canada and stigma surrounding drug use occur to this day. Criminalization leads to stigmatization.
Well, I mean, the main stigma against drug users is in the law. You're a criminal. It's illegal. So the law is the main way how society decides what behavior is okay, who's kind of within the tent of civilization, and who's an outcast.
Across the Atlantic Ocean, the Portuguese government took on a dramatic stance on drug use as they decriminalized almost every aspect of possession. Angie Hamilton describes how this stance fundamentally changed how addiction is dealt with, leading to fewer overdoses.
And they decided the best thing they could do was to decriminalize possession of drugs for personal use and take the money that would have gone to prosecuting those people and put it into treatment. And they have had tremendous success. They have low overdose rates. They did not see a jump in addiction in youth or anything like that.
By reducing charges against those who utilize drugs, we can create a drug policy that makes a safer community and works towards treatment instead of punishment. Flood focuses on 4 pillars of drug policy: addiction, policy, prevention, and harm reduction. Leah Chapman is a registered nurse and harm reduction activist that aims to set up supervised consumption services for people who use drugs. In her words, harm reduction specifically states that
I think harm reduction just says we're going to meet you where you're at in your drug use and try to reduce the harms associated with substance use by providing sterile harm reduction supplies so that you're not putting yourself at greater risk each time you use.
bringing harm reduction services to communities does not promote substance abuse. Drug use happens regardless. Having and promoting a safe environment to do drugs can create an essential safety net that reduces overdose rates. Sometimes, the biggest issue regarding the overdose epidemic is that those who use drugs feel disconnected from society and their community.
I know for me, the hardest thing was feeling like it was me versus them. It was the street and using community versus the world. And that's why I didn't mind if I stole from people or if I was morally making negative decisions that impacted communities. I didn't care at the time because I was so segregated from the whole entire world. At least that's how it felt for me at that time. I know originally I thought recovery was abstinence, and I'm learning more and more each day that recovery is connection.
Sometimes, surviving the overdose epidemic simply means having someone to talk to and connect with that understands the struggles surrounding drug use. Reducing stigmatization and criminalization can create a closer community that is aware and willing to aid those who use and lessen the effects of the epidemic. Inside the overdose epidemic is a substance that is more prevalent now in the modern era than ever before. Opioids are a naturally occurring substance from the poppy plant that aims to provide pain relief effects, such as anesthesia. In other words,
these are a class of drugs that include heroin, morphine. They include some legal drugs and illegal drugs. Most of the deaths occurring now are because we have a contamination of the illegal drug supply with a drug called fentanyl.
Medically speaking, opioids affect opioid receptors in the brain that produce effects similar to morphine, but on a much bigger scale. The likelihood of becoming addicted to an opioid is much more substantial than any other substance. Richard Rigo, the clinical director at Beacon Pharmacy, and Dr. Evan Wood, the director of the BC Centre on Substance Use, further explains the effects of opioids on the brain.
It sits in the receptors in the brain that stimulate euphoria, and that's why people use it.
And what we know now is that when you give people opioids like morphine or OxyContin, the brain changes. It changes very quickly to downregulate the pain fibers because you have all this opioid sloshing around. And you can actually get something called hyperalgesia, where you feel more pain because of the opioids, and then you have to go up on the opioid dose, which leads to more side effects and tolerance and withdrawal if you stop, and ultimately addiction.
The biggest issue with opioids is their availability to the general public. Despite this, opioids continue to be sold both legally at pharmacies and illegally through the black market. The accessibility and power of opioids lead to every 1 in 5 people becoming long-term users of opioids during their first exposure. Dr. Jane Buxton, the harm reduction lead for the BC Centre for Disease Control, states her concern for the alarming rate of overdose deaths in Canada.
I've never seen anything like this in my career. We've had instances where there was a slight increase in overdose deaths, for example, but that was very, very minor compared to what we're seeing now.
Overdosing and substance abuse touches everyone. In the words of Dr. Morhaime, it's every community, every socioeconomic stratum, from the very poor to the very rich, across races and across gender. The overdose epidemic does not discriminate. Despite this, many people are willing to ignore a widespread problem unless it touches them directly. In BC alone, 1,390 people died by overdose between the August of 2017 and 2018. Again, further driving these deaths is the prevalent stigma surrounding those who use drugs. Petra Scholes lost her son due to an overdose. In her eyes, stigma prevents people from reaching out and getting the help that they need.
We often think that people who use are selfish. They only think about themselves, and they don't care about the people who love them, but they do. They deeply, deeply care, and they feel guilty.
Knowing that stigma and a lack of resources are the main issues surrounding overdose-related deaths, there are a few responses created in order to reduce these problems. First, crash kits are an emergency kit that contains artificial airways, supplies, and medication, specifically Narcan or naloxone. Narcan is a counter-medication used to immediately reduce the effects of opioids, allowing for better response time for medical professionals. Another strategy for reducing overdose-related deaths is to create supervised consumption sites.
Supervised consumption facilities, since we're talking about saving lives, the number of overdose deaths, not overdoses, but overdose deaths in supervised consumption facilities is 0. That 0 means none. And if our goal is to save lives, they clearly do.
These sites include the necessary supplies needed in order to consume drugs in a safe and supervised manner. Through these precautions, the amount of risk a user would normally endure has been eliminated.
Unless we're going to ignore the suffering of people at every level of society, why would we want to ignore it at the level of people who are addicted to drugs? And so harm reduction, to me, is not controversial. What is controversial is that it is controversial.
While harm in reduction is an excellent way to remove the risks associated with substance abuse, as mentioned previously, almost all stigma is rooted within the law itself.
Our aim is to change drug policy, change it away from a focus on criminal justice and blame the person to actually seeing it as what it is. It's a health issue.
The criminalization and the war on drugs continue to be some of the biggest factors contributing to overdose-related deaths. Dr. Nadir of the Correctional Health Services explains how much substance use is rooted within our criminal justice system.
At least 60% of people coming into prison have a substance use disorder. And if you include the crime related to substance use, that number goes up to 80%.
We're not going to arrest our way out of this.
Not only is this an expense on our justice system, but it's also a burden on every taxpayer who pays for a system that fails to see the real problem.
That for every dollar invested in substance abuse treatment, you save $7 to $10 in societal expenses.
In order to decriminalize drug use, we need to remove the societal stigma that places pressure on those who use drugs and shy them away from seeking help.
But I think there's something much stronger than hope. There's possibility. And possibility exists in the present moment. So people can wake up in the present moment. They don't have to hope, they can just wake up.
The overdose epidemic is a war that has raged in Canada for a long time, and similarly to a silhouette, becomes unnoticed unless there is a light shone upon it. But it doesn't have to be. First, we need to acknowledge that Canada's way of dealing with drugs has taken the wrong path. Both the stigmatization and criminalization of drug use have increased the amount of overdoses in Canada and steers people away from seeking help. Second, by implementing harm reduction, safe consumption sites, and updated drug policies, we can ensure that the epidemic does not take any more lives than it needs to. We need to acknowledge the problem and create effective solutions that target substance abuse at its core. It's about discussion, it's about education, and it's about compassion. And it all starts with us.